Waleed Shahid is the spokesperson for Justice Democrats. And as he comes in, let me explain why I wanted to talk to Waleed today, because I was saying before Joe Biden started to speak, I was in my late 20s when Bill Clinton became president. I was in my early 40s when Barack Obama became president. And I remember the relief, feeling that president is gone, whether it was Reagan era or whether it was George Bush. And in both instances, there was a sense that the country sort of went to sleep on some level, and the problems that were pre-existing maintained themselves, and they were not addressed. And we have these problems. And Waleed, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I wanted to bring you on because I wanted to start from day one. There was a very long honeymoon for Barack Obama. It wasn't until months later that progressives started to realize, like, hey, wait a second, he's not doing what he said about the bankruptcy cram down and whatnot. Now, obviously, we have a situation with a pandemic here. So Joe Biden's job number one, I think, across the ideological spectrum, unless you start getting into sort of conservative land, frankly, is you got to address this. But there's a lot of other things that go with addressing that and can build resiliency and durability within our society. From your perspective at Justice Democrats, like, what are those things?
You're talking about in terms of the policy stuff, or what is working in terms of like how we plan to pressure Biden?
Well, let's talk about the policy things about okay, what you want to pressure him about. I mean, how you're going to pressure him is one thing, but what are the things that from your perspective are progressives? And frankly, you know, we're talking about a lot of young people out there, and by young, I mean below the age of 40, who, when they hear Joe Biden give a speech about unity, they're all like, well, that's well and good. But the fact is, we have some real fractures in this country that are not just sort of dispositional. They are situational. And there's a lot of people suffering. And I think they want to know what he's going to do about it.
Right. I mean, we can talk about the frequent use of the passive voice by Joe Biden in that speech about what caused our crisis, how we got here, who is dividing America. It was a lot of nebulous forces in our country who are doing these things, which is a callback to a lot of Obamaisms from his presidency. But in terms of the policy, I mean, there are a lot of things that progressives and specifically young people are waiting to hear from Joe Biden on within the next few weeks. Student loan cancellation is one thing. Chuck Schumer has supported a bill with Elizabeth Warren to cancel 50,000. Joe Biden wants to cancel 10,000. There's also, you know, he has said that it's unclear whether he plans to do that or not. Yesterday, he announced, to the great joy of a lot of immigration rights advocates, his plan to introduce legislation to provide a pathway for relief from deportation for 11 million undocumented immigrants, and also a pathway to citizenship for those 11 million undocumented immigrants. That has been on the back burner for since 2006. Right. No one has had relief from those deportations that have skyrocketed, specifically under President Obama. And then obviously the climate crisis. Just this past weekend, the Sunrise Movement held actions at Senator Schumer and Senator Durbin's homes, calling for action on climate to be a number one priority. Joe Biden says he intends to include significant climate investments in this multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package, which is probably going to be announced in February or March. And there are a series of actions being held tomorrow. So to your point, where progressives perhaps sat on their hands when Obama was elected, that is not true this time around, with the action that we've seen from progressive movements, with the actions happening all across the country tomorrow by the Sunrise Movement, and also the voices that members of the Squad and the Progressive Caucus have already raised since November on things like the COVID relief, things on what the Democrats are doing to hold Republicans accountable for the insurrection. That was just not the case in 2009. And so I am optimistic for the next 9 months, in part because I have to be, because if we can't get things done in the next 9 months, then I don't know what happens after that. We've sat around for 10 years waiting for unified control. So if we can't figure out how to deliver results for the American people, it's really I think, a doomsday scenario for our democracy and for people in this country and across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that I was struck by too. This Biden speech. Now he did, he ticked off. He said healthcare. He said climate change. Much of the speech was, it was both sort of like metaphorical in the sense that there was sort of like, well, it is true that as a nation we are dealing with a pandemic, and on some level, like the passive quality, like this pandemic came upon us. It wasn't a function of somebody, hitting a button or somebody, executing a policy, and we have a pandemic. The extremity of this pandemic, I think, is a failure of policy. But everything else he referred to was as if we were fighting some outside enemy, and without a sort of acknowledgement that it's not just, we're not just having a dispositional disagreement. There are people who are pursuing their agenda, and it's coming at the cost of the agenda of hundreds of millions of people, corporations, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what is the plan from a progressive perspective on how to focus Joe Biden's, attention? Like, at one point, when do we start to, how do we break down? This is rhetoric that a lot of people are going to tune out of politics after today, and they're going to go, Joe Biden's a good guy. And if they hear like maybe Mitch McConnell is preventing Joe Biden from doing his plan, maybe that'll have some benefit for Democrats. But he also needs to actually make that pivot, right, at one point in practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, to your point, I mean, there's this weird part of American civic religion that somehow Abraham Lincoln was an extremely unifying figure who brought the country together in this very peaceful way to take on the slaveholding oligarchy in the South and move past our divisions magically. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the most divisive figures in American history. We had a Civil War, and Biden again and again refers to Abraham Lincoln as a unifying figure. But and Lincoln pursued a path of the abolition of slavery and the destruction of the slaveholding oligarchy in the South was, by all means, a controversial move at the time. And so it's this weird part of American civic religion that that things just happen out of our kind hearts and bringing the country together. When in actuality, there was a literal war that happened, and Lincoln was moved to fight that war against a pernicious force in our democracy that was rebelling against the country. In terms of,
let me just put even a finer point on that point, because we have done many interviews about Reconstruction, which follows. I just did an interview that I pre-taped yesterday about one of the massacres that followed through Reconstruction. I mean, there are literally just a massacre per state that took place through Reconstruction to usher in Jim Crow. It's quite clear to me, anyways, after interviewing a lot of historians, that this unity really never happened. I mean, it's conceivable, I think, on some level, that we came together when we fought World War I to some extent, and certain, maybe World War II to some extent. But really, like, there was no, in terms of Lincoln, I mean, obviously he was shot to death. But there was no real, this unity, like you say, it is an article of faith that really is highly elusive. And there's no evidence, I think, in American history that, at least in improving domestic situations, that the pursuit of unity brings us that.
Yeah. I mean, we could argue about, Lincoln also uses the language of unity to achieve his goals. And so perhaps it's just rhetorical, but there is this weird, we obscure what actually happened. We don't, the story of what happens to Abraham Lincoln is never even mentioned.
Right.
And that, but to answer your second question, I think there are several people on Biden's economic team who are genuine progressives. Bharat Ramamurthy, Ali Zaidi on the climate task force, people like Heather Bushey, Jared Bernstein. Their job is not to be people who deliver speeches, their job is to make sure the COVID relief package is as bold as it can be, and can get through Congress. Their job is to work on that infrastructure package that is upcoming. And I do think that, it is night and day between what this administration is proposing versus what the Obama administration proposed. Yeah. I mean, the Obama administration was afraid, because of Rahm Emanuel and Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner, to use the T word, and the T word was trillion. And, that said, there are improvements that I believe progressives are going to push for on things related to the stimulus checks, things related to the amount of childcare subsidies that are going out in this relief package, things that are going on with the expansion of Medicare, perhaps. But it is, we should acknowledge the historic shift that has happened in the Democratic Party. And while there is much to push on, the inclusion of the $15 minimum wage in this package is a victory that progressives should celebrate. This is something that progressives were the ones who fought on this issue for years. From 2012 to 2016, it was a radical, crazy idea, so much so that Hillary Clinton wouldn't embrace it in the presidential primary. And so I do want to savor this moment today also, that there are victories that progressives have won. And I know that this thing tends to happen when progressives push and push and push for something. The Democratic establishment eventually claims it, and then we forget that it was our idea to begin with. But it's important to say that, we helped deliver those victories.
Yeah, and that shift in the Democratic Party, I would say, is a large result of the work that Justice Democrats have done in just primarying the right-wing Democrats and getting a lot of these progressives through, shifting the Overton window, which is an overused phrase. But I think the point about more things being possible with Biden than even with Obama because of the people surrounding him, it is true. And also, I think there's this perception that Biden is more conservative than Obama, which I guess is true based on the rhetoric that was used. I mean, Obama ran on more progressive rhetoric, but then again, surrounded himself by people like Summers and Rahm Emanuel. And Biden, Sam makes this point, and I think it's so well said. He likes to place himself at the center of the Democratic Party and then go from there. And the Democratic Party has shifted because of these progressive lawmakers and because they've changed what's possible. Can you talk about the role of some of the Justice Democrat candidates in pushing that conversation forward more specifically?
Well, I think one success point or one effect of the Justice Democrats' victories in the past two cycles, first with AOC and Ayanna Pressley, and then with Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Marie Newman, and others, is that it's actually created space for the inclusion of those people in the Progressive Caucus, helped organize the Progressive Caucus this year to pass a reform package that will make them into a more cohesive, unified body in which, the chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, who is also Justice Democrat, has said she intends to use that as a leverage point to organize the bloc much more than it's ever been organized, to push for concessions from Nancy Pelosi. The inclusion of checks at all in Trump's stimulus deal that was passed before Biden took office was because of Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal both pushing for some sort of checks to be included. That is a huge achievement of the effect of work of the Justice Democrats, of the Sunrise Movement, of the DSA. And I think we're going to see that continue into the administration on immigration, on childcare, on climate, on justice reform issues. And what has happened is that someone like Joe Biden or someone like Chuck Schumer will say, I represent the center point of the Democratic Party. That center has moved. If you can grab hold of that center and shift it, it can move a lot of things. The last time progressives were able to unseat a incumbent corporate-backed Democrat from the left in a primary, and then for Congress was like Donna Edwards in 2006. So there was like a huge gap between 2006 and 2018. And so if you can show that your movement can actually deliver votes and unseat people, which is extremely hard to do because, I've spent the past 2 years doing that, it goes a long way, even if it's just a handful of seats.
That last point, I think folks really need to have that in the forefront of their mind. What Justice Democrats have been able to do in the course of two cycles is really stunning based upon what the experience in the 20 years prior to that was.